Are you a Golden Bear fan who loves the University of California? Well, if you're like us and are unabashedly and unapologetically all about Cal, you found the right place. Welcome to Tell the Whole Damn World and our special Cal History episode. We celebrate all things Cal and hope to make you feel more connected to this wonderful university that has given all of us so much. Thanks so much for joining us. It's Friday, June 13th, 2025. I'm your host, Reza Sirafinejad, and it's another great day to be a bear. In today's episode, our resident Cal history expert, Leslie Mitchell, and I talk about one of the greatest costume designers to have ever lived, Walter Plunkett. He did costume design for Gone with the Wind, Singin' in the Rain, and An American in Paris. And that's just scratching the surface with all the work he did on different movies during Hollywood's golden age. Before we get to that, I want to thank all of you out there listening and watching. For those of you watching TV news and lamenting all the bad news going on in the world, consider making a little time each week to watch us on YouTube. Unlike the news, we can promise we'll always do our best to put a smile on your face and help you come away feeling good about your connection to the greatest university on the planet. And please help us spread the word about this podcast. Share us on your social media. Tell all your Cal friends. Speaking on behalf of all of us here, including Ahmad and Leslie, we are so grateful for each and every one of you making the time to listen and watch. Okay, give me just a moment and I'll be right back with Leslie and we'll learn all about Walter Plunkett.
This week in Cal History.
For those of you who don't yet know, Leslie Mitchell is our resident Cal history expert. She's a third-generation Cal alum, history major, and lifelong Golden Bear fan who writes wonderfully informative articles about notable people connected with our university who have done great things in this world. You can visit her website, calbearshistory.com, or follow her on Twitter at calbearshistory to read some of her stuff. We are so lucky to have Leslie as part of the show. You hear me say it all the time, but I think she's awesome. Today, Leslie and I are going to talk about Walter Plunkett, a man who was perhaps the greatest and most prolific costume designer of all time. He worked on 269 different projects throughout his career in the Hollywood film industry, most notably Gone with the Wind and Singin' in the Rain, was nominated 10 times for the Academy Award, and won an Academy Award for his work on An American in Paris. Welcome again to the show, Leslie.
Well, thank you, Reza, as always, for your nice comments. He was quite something. And I had the great honor and privilege of being able to hear him speak at Cal when I was an undergraduate in the late 70s. He came and they showed Singing in the Rain, and then he did gave a little talk and did question and answer afterwards at Wheeler Auditorium, where he had acted in plays 50 years earlier, which is pretty crazy. Yeah, he started out wanting to be an actor, and he came to Cal. I guess he was in a couple of high school plays and such, and he came to Cal. But he came to Cal, he was pre-law. And he's quoted as saying that what cured him of wanting to be a lawyer was taking a jurisprudence class right after lunch, and he couldn't stay awake.
Right.
As a lawyer myself, I can totally relate to this.
Yeah, that probably is a good way to kind of weed out the people who are not meant to be lawyers, right? Right there. But to back up a little bit, I guess he's a Bay Area native. He was born in Oakland in 1902. And he attended Cal from 1919 through 1923. So he got to see firsthand those wonder teams of 1920, 21,
he was there in the Andy Smith years and the Rose Bowl years and all of that. Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
So anyway, eventually he changed to being an English major, which I can also relate to because he was a big literature fan. And he got involved in they didn't have a drama department or a theater department back then, but there was a student group called the Mask and Dagger, which all the students who were interested in theater I was going to say, or film, but really film wasn't quite yet a thing. I mean, there were silent films in 1919, but it wasn't really a place you thought of to go make a lot of money at that point. So he was involved in that. He wanted to be an actor, but he was also really into design and art. I don't think he never apparently had considered costume design, which again wasn't necessarily really something that people thought of as doing professionally because it was so limited in the theater the jobs that were available. But he was the art director for the Blue and Gold Yearbook, and he also was the art director for the Pelican. If those of us who are a little older remember that Pelican was a humor magazine at Cal that lasted for about 80 years.
Yeah, it I guess started up in 1902 or something right around that period of time and lasted, like you said, for 80 years and preceded the heuristic squelch, which I remember from my time and always liked
Well, we
a
had the
lot.
Pelican in my day, and the Pelican building that has that big pelican out in front. That's why that exists, is because that was built for the Pelican, the humor magazine.
Oh, okay. I did not know
And
that.
that's
That's
why that
pretty
has that.
cool.
People wonder why that pelican sits out there in front of that statue of that pelican. Yeah.
That's cool.
Um,
And part of the California Pelican is, if I understand things correctly, Rube Goldberg, right, was a contributor to that as well
he was
back
one
in
of
the
the
day.
founders. Yes.
Wow, wow, yeah, another notable alum that I'm sure we'll talk about
Yes, we
in a
will.
later Cal
And no
history
doubt we
episode.
will. Yes.
All right, all right.
Uh, Back to Walter Plunkett, though. Uh, when he graduated, and I love this story. What a great dad. His dad gave him a ticket to New York and said, go pursue your dreams, son. Which, how many parents do that with a kid that says, oh, I want to be in the theater?
Right,
Not
right,
very many.
right.
So he went off to New York to try to make his name as an actor. Did not have a huge amount of success there. Again, a kid from Berkeley that was in a couple of plays in college and so forth with no real serious acting training or experience. It's not exactly easy to break in on Broadway. But he made enough appearances to make a living and get by. Uh, but he eventually decided, as so many people were doing in the mid 1920s, he decided to come out to Hollywood because by that time, film had started to become a pretty big deal. It was still the silent movie days, but there were blockbuster movies like Ben-Hur, which was the silent version, which was the biggest box office film for decades. That was in 1926. So these movies, film, they were becoming a big industry by that time. So he came out to Los Angeles, and he was still planning to be an actor because that's what he had always wanted to do. And the story he told us, he did have a friend that he had met in New York, a guy named Howard Greer, who had come out to Hollywood, and he was a costume designer. So he'd met him in the theater in New York. So he did have a little bit of a hint that he might be interested, that costume designing was a thing that could be done. But he still wasn't really considering it. The story he told us when he came and talked at Cal in the late 70s was he was waiting outside the gates of Paramount Studio. That famous gate that you see in all the movies and stuff of Paramount. And he's waiting there with a bunch of other guys and women who were getting extra work. And he said they paid $5 a day to be an extra, which was just not quite enough to survive on at that point. And somebody came out and said, hey, we need some help in the costume department. We're paying $10 a day for anybody that is willing to help us out today. And so he said, well, yeah, why would I not
Sure.
take double the money? So he went in, and the job they assigned him, they were making one of those great silent biblical epics. And the job he was assigned was to paint rose petals around the nipples of young women who were going to be extras in this biblical epic. And yes, they did have topless women in movies in the 1920s, which is something we're all used to. The production code that went into effect in the 30s, where you could only have single beds. You couldn't even show a double bed because that was considered, a married couple had to sleep in twin beds, and just crazy stuff like that. And yet, in the 20s, before the crackdown came, it's pretty wild stuff. And so that was his first job in the costume department. And he said to us, I thought I could do this.
Doesn't sound like bad work.
He got a huge laugh, of course. Um, He came back and they asked him to come back for the next few days. And then, his friend, Howard Greer, gave him a recommendation to RKO, which was another studio, because they were looking for somebody
Right, and
higher on.
RKO, I wasn't familiar with this until I really looked it up, but RKO was one of the five big film studios of that era, and we're basically talking about Hollywood's golden age,
Right.
right? So one of the top five at that period in time.
It was number 5. It was always the slightly struggling of the major studios. It later was bought out by one of their young starlets that they had in the 30s was a young woman named Lucille Ball, and she and her husband uh, made so much money off of the rights to a sitcom they made called I Love Lucy that they eventually bought RKO. So she was able to buy the studio she had started out at, and then eventually that was taken over by Paramount, which was next door to RKO because.
I see it. Well, and RKO, if I'm not mistaken, was famous for a lot of the different kind of dance heavy kind of movies featuring Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. Is that right?
Well, they were not really famous per se for dance movies, but they were famous. But they did give the start to Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, who made 9 movies there. So that it wasn't they weren't famous as the dance movie studio, but they had Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. So what else do you really need? And their other big star was Katharine Hepburn. Those were kind of their biggies where they made their money. And yeah, he designed the dresses for Ginger Rogers for her first 2 movies with Fred Astaire, and later would do another film with them at MGM. He kind of gave the style that that became her signature style in her dance routines with Fred Astaire, with sort of a tight waist and then a flaring skirt that would wrap around. If you've ever seen their movies, which I love, I am a huge fan of old movies. This flowing skirt that sort of matches the dance movements and then would wrap around her when she stopped and then unwrap after she stopped. It has this great look to it,
Sure.
which really adds a lot to the dances. And I think if you're watching for the costumes, I think in any dance movie this is true. Certainly in those great Fred and Ginger movies, the costume adds so much to the dance. It actually enhances the dance.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think there's any question about that. I mean, yeah, and you look back at some of those old movies, and the dancing itself is pretty spectacular. But I have to agree that, yeah, the costume adds quite a bit to it for sure. Makes it quite the spectacle. Yeah, I was gonna ask a little bit about he had a pretty good relationship then with these famous starlets of that era, and Ginger Rogers and Carol Lombard, and also most notably Katharine Hepburn as well, where one of the things, at least that I read, was that she actually leaned on him and kind of asked for his advice on different acting jobs where she was supposed to portray somebody. And so I think they had a pretty special bond and relationship.
They became instant friends when her second movie that she ever made. From the story I read is she was kind of being difficult. She was still very young and insecure and wasn't really sure, and she'd get kind of mad and be harsh. And he said to her, "Wow, you keep that up, and you'll be as big a bitch as Constance Bennett, who was another famous actress at the time." And Hepburn thought that was hilarious, and that just immediately they became buddies. So good for both of them. And yeah, he did her costumes, all the rest of her costumes at RKO. And in fact, later in his career, after he was having trouble during the Depression finding work because Hollywood had to cut back on their film budgets, and she was the one who insisted that no, he has to do my costumes. I won't come back to make this movie unless you get Walter Plunkett to do my costumes.
Yeah.
So yeah, they were pretty tight. Also, it's also important to note, particularly with this being Pride Month, that Walter Plunkett was a gay man, and which is not surprising because at that point in Hollywood history, basically the entire costume department the men in the costume departments were almost all gay, and the art departments. It was sort of, where they were allowed to express their creative work and get paid decent money for it. And fortunately for him, Hollywood was much more accepting of alternate lifestyles than most of the rest of the country, Hollywood and New York, Broadway. Um,
Right.
and
Well,
so, go ahead.
from some of the things that I'd read about him is that, people kind of remarked that he was very comfortable in, who he was. And he didn't try to put on any airs or pretend. He was just very comfortable in his own skin and a genuine person when you met him. And, just, how you can kind of sense that somebody's trying to pretend to be somebody that they're not, but he was not that at all. So.
Well, and a story I read is that on the census form in 1940, where you have to write down what the relationship is, who the head of household is, and who else is there, and what their relationship is, he wrote down that his partner was his partner, which is pretty stunning thing to do in 1940 because it was, people didn't want to admit things like that. It was dangerous. I thought of my own grandfather. If I just as an aside, I was doing some family history research on Ancestry.com, and I came across the 1920 census, and it says that he was living with his half sister, and I'm like, he didn't have a half sister. I never heard of a half sister. So I looked this woman up. No, she wasn't his half sister. He just didn't want to say in the form that he was living with a woman to whom he was not married because it was scandalous. So,
Sure.
Grandpa, who knew grandpas did stuff like that? But anyway, that was much less scandalous than being gay in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. So, but he didn't care. He was going to, he's going to be who he was.
Right. And it seemed like, in Hollywood in that era was probably a safe place to be, gay and be himself. So at least he found a safe harbor.
In fact, from what I've read, he was very sympathetic and tried to help out other gay people, to the point where he would read a story or be told a story about some young man who had been arrested because it was illegal to solicit, or to go to a gay bar, or, the cops decided they were going to crack down on some gay hangout. And he would read a story like that, and he would go down and post bail for complete strangers,
Right.
to help them out, which is pretty awesome.
Yeah. I mean, that it really is. I mean, sounded like he was very kind-hearted in that regard for sure.
He had a reputation as just being a really nice guy. And nobody, you never hear a story of anybody who didn't like him. And I have to say, when he spoke at Cal, in the 1970s, he came across that way. He came across as just, wow, I'd like to know him. He's a nice guy.
Sure. No, it's the way everybody should try to be.
Yes.
The world would be a much better place if everyone just
it would
tried to be nice to each other.
He made did the costumes for some of the most famous movies in Hollywood history. One of his early big hits that he did the costumes for was, well, I'll tell you the story about the actress who was the lead actress, a woman named Fay Wray. She said the producer came to her and said, "You're going to have the tallest, darkest leading man in all of Hollywood." And she said, "I thought I was going to get Clark Gable. Instead, I got King Kong."
Oh,
The original King Kong film from 1933. He did her costumes for that, and that's the character that, well, you could say she's the star, but of course, really King Kong is the star of that movie. But she's the one that gets carried up to the top of the Empire State Building in the big final scene.
Sure.
And then he did, as you said, he did well over 200 films, so you couldn't possibly list them all.
No, I mean, I looked just at a Wikipedia page about him, and it just ran on and on and on and on with all the different films. I mean, just incredibly prolific. But I thought, Gone with the Wind, I think, is obviously
probably what he's, well, that and Singing in the Rain are what he's most famous for.
Right.
Right. And Gone with the Wind, yeah, it was a hard movie to do because it was so much pressure on him. On everybody. It was the number one hit novel in the country. And I think before we say anything more, I want to acknowledge that there are issues with Gone with the Wind because it's very insensitive to the book especially, but the movie also, to racial issues, and downplays the horrors of slavery and so forth. But nevertheless, it was like the hit book the hit movie of the of the 20th century, really, when you look at the sales statistics. And the most sought after job in Hollywood was to play Scarlett O'Hara, who was the main character of Gone with the Wind. But he was hired. They had this huge nationwide casting search for who was going to play Scarlett, and it went on for literally 3 years. And before they finally picked Vivian Leigh to be the star. And so he was hired to design the costumes, and he had no idea who he was designing the costumes for, because the actress hadn't been cast. She wasn't cast till like practically the last minute, which is wild. So he was, well, obviously there were other characters that were cast, but still he had to just kind of do, well, here's the general idea, but how is she going to look, whoever this actress is in this outfit? I'll have. So it was kind of chaotic, really. There's a very famous dress in that film where, and it's from the book, where Scarlett O'Hara, it's after Sherman has gone through and they don't have any money, and she needs to go to Atlanta to try to pretend like she's got money so Rhett Butler will marry her, blah, blah, blah. And she's just dressed in rags. And she realizes the only thing she can do is take her mother's curtains and turn them into a dress. Well, he made it. He had to do that, of course. And I think it literally was the most famous costume in all of Hollywood history. Maybe even still is today, that he made this, it was green velveteen sort of curtains, and he turned it into this remarkable dress.
Right. But when I mentioned to my wife that we were going to be talking about Walter Plunkett, and I was telling her a little bit about him being this incredible costume designer, and her first thought went to Gone with the Wind. That was like the very first movie that came to the top of her mind. And he had a wonderful quote about this that I'll just read here real quickly. It said, "That dress was not the best costume of motion pictures, not by a long shot, but I am very happy to think it is the most famous costume. There's hardly a day that goes by that you don't hear somebody talking about pulling down the curtains to make a dress or something of that nature. So I'm proud that it was mine."
Yeah, and it is a great costume, and it does look like it could have been made out of curtains.
Right, it really does.
And there's one of the things he talked about when I heard him speak in Berkeley is there was a very famous skit on the Carol Burnett show, which was a show that was a comedy skit show in the 60s, 70s, 80s. It was on forever. People our age probably all grew up watching the Carol Burnett show. There was a very famous skit she did where she was playing Scarlett O'Hara, and she comes down the stairs in that curtain dress, except she's got the curtain rod going through her shoulders. And that sort of brought that dress back to fame, because it's so absurd, and it's wonderful. And he said that she called him personally and said, "Is it okay if we do this? I don't want to, denigrate your work." And he was delighted to have her do it. They invited him to be at the show and on the set when they were doing the skit. And he said she couldn't have been nicer, and it was just a great experience all around.
Right.
I think they called it "The Wind Done Went" or something like that was the name of the skit. But so yeah, that was one of his most famous films. Ironically, the film that was 1939. The film he got the Oscar for in 1951, An American in Paris, is not nearly as well remembered, although it got the Oscar for Best Picture. It's in another musical.
Sure. Well, Gene Kelly, I mean, it was incredible, right? No, I love that film for sure. And Singing in the Rain, and both those with Gene Kelly. But.
Yep. Singing in the Rain was 1954. That's one of my all-time favorites. It's so funny. It's still funny today. It's about, again, one of the things that makes it interesting is it was about the transition period from silent movies to sound movies. And this actress that has a horrible voice, and
right.
It's a musical comedy set in Hollywood in the 1920s. And Walter Plunkett said, "Yeah, basically, I was doing the same costumes and suddenly that I had been doing 25 years ago for real, that were the actual costumes. Now I was making as the sort of parody costumes, and they're quite spectacular. There's a great scene in there in Singing in the Rain where they do like this it's kind of weird. It's like a film within a film sequence where they're showing like a fashion show of all these women in different kinds of outfits. And he said, again, when I heard him speak, he said that was one of the most enjoyable things he ever did, because he just got to go wild, insane costumes.
That's awesome. No, I mean, it certainly sounds like he had incredible talent and he just loved to do. I mean, he just found his perfect niche, right? That's exactly what he was meant to do. And I thought it was notable because, at the top of the show, we talked about how, it was 269 different films that he contributed and worked on and was nominated for the Academy Award 10 different times. But it's notable that much of his work was done at a time when they did not award an Oscar for Best Costume Design.
He was not nominated for an Oscar for Gone with the Wind because there was no costume designer for Oscar at that time.
Almost certain they would have won it, right? So the first awards came out for Best Costume Design at the 21st Academy Awards in 1949.
Correct. So all of his career in the 20s and the 30s and most of the 40s, that wasn't done. Also, some of his work, is uncredited. His work on King Kong, for example, he did Fay Wray's costumes, but it's uncredited because they gave the credit to the head of the costume department. And you watch a movie now, and at the end of the movie, there's like 5 minutes of, the caterer, the producer's brother-in-law, whoever wants to gets a credit now. But back then, if you watch old movies, they give like 30 seconds of credits at the end. They hardly give anything. And basically the department head would get the credit, and everyone else who worked on it got zero credit.
Yeah.
So he probably wouldn't have gotten the Oscar even if they'd had one, because they didn't give credit. But he eventually became a freelance, which gave him a lot more control over what he worked on. In the old studio system, if you were under contract, you just had to do whatever they told you to do. You had no choice in your work. So at some point, a lot of artistic types became freelance if they could. Once you got a certain reputation, you could do that.
Yeah. So just to kind of flash forward then, I guess, he had this incredibly long and distinguished career in Hollywood for sure, and seemed like he was universally beloved. He passed away at the age of 79 in Beverly Hills, and to talk about how he was a gay man living in this era, and at the age of 79, I think he passed away in 82, I believe. So to me, at least, that doesn't seem that long ago, 43 years ago. But at that time,
I had already graduated from Cal by that time. So yeah, that's just recent.
Right. But he had to actually formally adopt his long-term partner in order to make sure that he would be able to inherit his estate.
And so have just to say over medical decisions and all that kind of stuff. Visit him, and even visit in the hospital. There was no right to that in 1982.
Right. Kind of crazy to think, but yeah.
It's really kind of icky when you think about it, to adopt your partner as your child.
It is just a
so
formality.
That they can be legally part of your life.
I'm just so thrilled that you brought this incredible person to my attention, because again, I feel like these are incredible people who went to Cal, who've done incredible things in this world, and I would never have thought about him had you not suggested that we talk about him. And
I have to say, going to see him at when he came to speak at Berkeley, they did a screening of, I think I told you that, the screening of Singin' in the Rain, and then he did Q&A afterwards. And I was so excited. I went, I was like, okay, I love Singin' in the Rain. This guy was a big time costume designer. I like old movies. Of course, the old movies weren't quite as old then. This was 1979, I think. But it was such a delightful thing to hear him. And I took a friend of mine who wasn't particularly an old movie fan, and she loved it too. He was just a great guy, and it was really interesting. And my takeaway from that is, if you ever get an opportunity to go hear somebody speak who was somebody of interest, even a minor interest to you, go do it. Don't let it pass you by, because you never know what sort of hidden gem you're going to uncover.
Absolutely.
And I love that he came back to Berkeley to speak, when he was in his late 70s, because obviously he maintained his bond to Cal.
Right. No, that's what it's all about. Being connected to the greatest university on the planet. And just think that's incredible to think that the university's produced so many different people in so many different fields, right? I mean, this was not universally known as being connected to Cal, but I mean, just look at all the work he did. I mean, you really literally can't look back at all those incredible classic movies from the past and not have seen his work. And would they have been the same without him? Probably not. He contributed so
He
much
really
to.
set a standard for the research that he did. In fact, on Gone with the Wind, he very famously insisted that the undergarments that the actors wore be authentic to the period, because he said that's what you need, that in order to make the costume look appropriate to where they're wearing it. And the actors said, yeah, it kind of helps also to feel like you're in that era. But, that's not something they did in Hollywood in the 1930s to worry about, let's be as authentic as possible. But he was really, really into doing the research and really into the authenticity.
Yeah.
So he set a standard that a lot of people still aspire to.
Absolutely. Well, hey, thank you so much, Leslie. I think that was a great choice for this week. And I guess we'll see you again next week, huh?
I think you will. And by the way, Reza, go Bears.
Go Bears. Thanks, Leslie. Leslie is so good at gathering all this wonderful information about these amazing people from the past who went to Cal. Who knows if those movies from Hollywood's golden age would have been as incredible as they were without his flair for costume design. As you've heard me say before, this podcast is entirely a labor of love and a reflection of how much we love our university. Please help tell the whole damn world about us by sharing us with all your Cal friends. Simply share tellthewholedamnworld.com on the social media platform of your choice. You can also follow us on X at Win4Cal. That's Win, the number 4, Cal. Be sure to catch our next episode when it drops on Monday. Ahmad and I are super excited to learn more about Rod Benson, the former Cal basketball player who has gone on to become a nationally known columnist, a podcaster, an internationally acclaimed artist, and the author of a new book entitled Different Dude. If you haven't yet picked it up, I can tell you it's thoroughly entertaining, engaging, insightful, and downright hilarious at times. Thank you so much for tuning in. We sincerely appreciate all of you out there listening and watching. See you Monday. This podcast is about celebrating all things Cal and the prominent people who are passionate about the University of California. Do you feel Cal is the center of the universe? Do you bleed blue and gold? We want you to tell the whole damn world about it. Go Bears!